Welcome to our lesson on inflation. So, inflation's probably, of all of the things that we've done, a lot of the concepts within economics probably involve terms you've never heard of. Guessing for almost all of you, you're somewhat familiar with what the idea of inflation is. Though here we're going to make it, we're going to formalize it. There is a specific definition we have, and it might not be exactly what you have thought it was. But inflation refers to the general increase in prices. So that's what is happening with the overall price level, as we say, of goods and services in the economy. We say the general price level because inflation doesn't refer to a single product. It refers to prices overall. So while the price of college tuition may be going up, pretty significantly, much faster than the rate of all products on average, the price of computers and televisions and housing, for example, might be falling. So the overall increase in the price level might be 2%, 3%. That is what we mean by inflation. Now, if you're looking for a year-to-year comparison or a month-to-month comparison, that is what we would call the inflation rate. So when you hear of somebody saying, oh, well, inflation was 2%, really what they do mean is the inflation rate in this preceding, how much did prices change over the past couple of years. I don't know that the distinction is that crucial for this class, but it is nice to know what is meant exactly by inflation, what's meant by the inflation rate, which is the change from one period to another. So an example of inflation and the inflation rate from September 2011 to September 2012, the inflation rate was 2%. So overall, prices for all goods and services in the economy rose by 2%. Once again, though, it does not mean that every single product rose on average by 2%. Some products would have risen much faster rate than 2%. Others would have decreased in price. But overall, there's a 2% increase. Now, inflation, the definition says it's the increase in the general price level for goods and services. Well, what happens if that increase is negative? Or, to probably word it better, what happens if there's a decrease in the general price level of goods and services? So deflation is when the overall price level falls. It happened during the Great Depression. The demand was so low, and actually the change in the money, there were some issues with the money supply, and we'll learn a bit about monetary policy and how that affects the price level a little bit later. But combine a huge decrease in demand along with change in the money supply, and prices fell. Also, at the beginning of this recession, what's called the Great Recession, there was a period where prices dropped. So from September 2008 to September 2009, prices fell on average by 1.3%. So if you just held money in cash, if you $100, if you had $100 in September 2008, you just held it as cash. In September 2009, that $100 was worth more. It could buy you more because the price of all products had fallen on average in that year. So you could buy, you had increased purchasing power, is the phrase we would say. So we're going to look into a few subtopics with inflation. First, borders on the economic, the fact that whether something's liked or disliked, in a way it doesn't have that much relevance for economics, but what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the reasons inflation is disliked and look at whether these are, whether the public has it right on whether it's really credible, reasonable to dislike inflation for these reasons we're about to mention. Usually there are two related reasons. There could be others, but two of the main reasons. One, some claim inflation erodes purchasing power from wages. Right? If there's a CPI, if the inflation rate, one of the more common measures is the CPI, as we're going to learn later this lesson. If it's 3%, people might say, well, that means I can't buy as much, right? I'm working and I make a certain salary, and when there's a 3% inflation, I'm not, I don't have as much money then to spend on the products I would like to purchase. Seems reasonable enough. Very related reason. This would be for those who aren't earning wages, right? People who are retired, those who just aren't earning wages in general, claim that higher prices make it tougher to purchase products. That seems reasonable enough of a claim. However, both of these reasons aren't really very good reasons to dislike inflation. The reason for that is relative prices matter. What do we mean by relative prices? Well, relative prices mean the prices for products adjusted for how much money you're earning, or if you're receiving, say, Social Security because you're retired, relative to how much money you're receiving from these government benefit payments. So here's a chart, shows, I think, pretty clearly that wages adjust with inflation. Now, certainly these lines aren't going perfectly, but the dark blue shows inflation in consumer prices. The light, or I guess the gray line, shows the average hourly earnings. Notice the periods where there's higher inflation, there tends to be higher wage increases. In the periods where there's lower inflation, there's lower wage increases. This should make sense. Wages will adjust with inflation. So the idea that workers, that claim number one, workers are worse off because of inflation, on average, it's not true. People are getting wage increases that offset the increase in inflation. And that it should make sense from the idea inflation is an increase in the overall price level. Well, one of the things with prices are wages. The wage is the price firms have to pay to hire somebody. So if all wages go up by 3%, or if all prices go up by 3%, and the wage is included as one of those prices, then really workers shouldn't care, right? If you have $100 and the thing you want to buy is $100, you're just as well off as if you have $103 and the item you want to buy is $103. So wages do adjust with inflation. The idea that you have less purchasing power from your wages isn't really a legitimate reason. The other thing, for the idea of payments from the government on Social Security and those things, those are automatically adjusted for an inflation rate. And you'll hear this every year. If you watch the news, you'll see Social Security payments are going up by X% because to match the change in the consumer price index. So relative prices are the prices that account for the wage level. If wages go up the same rate as inflation, relative prices have remained constant. So if you get a 3% raise and inflation was 3%, you're not really wealthier because of that. But you haven't lost purchasing power. And that's what we'd say. We'd say relative prices then have remained constant. So this is a Zeke point here. Wages are typically adjusted for inflation. There is no systematic erosion of purchasing power of wages based on inflation. So hyperinflation, this is another sub-concept. This is a legitimate reason to dislike inflation. Now, if you had a hyperinflation episode in your country, this is absolutely devastating. It's quite seriously, quite honestly, it is probably the single worst thing that can happen to an economy. It just will absolutely destroy an economy if it happens. So occasionally throughout history, this has happened. And there have been times in the past couple decades, Zimbabwe is the biggest case recently, where there have been periods with extraordinarily high rates of inflation. Oops. So to qualify as hyperinflation, there's no set term. Usually the inflation rate would have to exceed 100% to 1,000% per year. You're watching this video, one thing I'd like you to try to do on your own, and we'll communicate about it then separately later off of the video. Pretend that you've come to college then as a freshman, and you go to the soda machine and the cost of a bottle of Coke, Pepsi, whatever it is $1.25. And the inflation rate is, let's say it's 200%. Let's say your senior year in the fall, so 3 years from now, 3 years from that moment, you go back to that Coke machine, and let's say that the price of the Coke machine is kept up exactly with inflation. If the price of that increases 200% per year, how much will that $1.25 Coca-Cola or Pepsi or whatever, how much will that cost exactly 3 years from now? I want you to try that on your own. We're going to communicate about that a little bit later. So if inflation causes prices to double every month, right? Double every month is something garden variety hyperinflation, and I know that'll sound crazy when prices double every month, but this is what often can happen when you have an episode of hyperinflation. What problems would this pose? Well, in theory, right, if wages adjusted to inflation as we saw, inflation shouldn't matter, but if it goes up this fast, you can't keep up. You can't figure out how to increase prices or wages to keep up with everything. So what would happen? Prices could rise daily or hourly. You've heard cases where people will be waiting in line, and people later in the line actually have to pay a somewhat higher price for products because prices just keep going up. You'd often have to carry large quantities of bills, right? If every year prices get 10 times higher, something that was $2 in the year 2014 would cost $20 in the year 2015, and it would cost $200 in the year 2016 and $2,000 in the year 2017, right? Coca-Cola is going to be pretty pricey then. You'd have to carry large quantities of bills just to make simple transactions. And really, what ends up happening with hyperinflation is money becomes worthless. And this is why hyperinflation, as I mentioned, I think it's the most devastating thing that can happen to an economy. It will throw everything out of whack in terms of work, right? How do you know what to pay somebody when you have no idea exactly how astronomical inflation is going to be? And why would you want to accept a job for some certain amount per year when you know that a month from now your salary might be half in terms of purchasing power of what it is now? But on top of that, it can completely destroy the savings. So you could have a class of people who've saved for 30 years and have a reasonably sized savings account. But if prices double year after year for 6 years, their savings could be worth pennies on the dollar. I mean, just literally, it can be nothing. And this isn't because they were taking risks. This is just because of hyperinflation. So money can become worthless. It's a picture, and you've heard stories of this. People would have to use wheelbarrows to wheel their money around because they would need that much to get around. So there's a kind of a phrase by Milton Friedman. I was the one who popularized it. That inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. It's the idea that the inflation rate is extremely tied to the money supply. The amount that the money supply goes up was going to drive the inflation rates pretty dramatically. And if you look here at the four different episodes of hyperinflation, all from the 1920s, you see that the rate of the money supply in blue tracks very closely the inflation rate in red. So not perfectly, but very, very closely. So Austria, Hungary, Germany, Poland all had hyperinflation episodes. All of them increased their money supply dramatically.